Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video for my ongoing Victorian-style serialised read-along of Charles Dickens's Bleak House. So this video is on October's chapters, a couple of weeks late. I apologise for that, but hopefully from now on we will be back on track. So in the month of October we read the following three chapters: Chapter 23, Esther's narrative; Chapter 24, An appeal case; and Chapter 25, Mrs. Snagsley sees it all. So as always, I will go through those three chapters, give you a brief synopsis of what happened in those chapters, and then talk about some points of interest in them. So, Chapter 23, Esther's narrative. At the beginning of Chapter 23, Esther, Ada and Mr. Jarndyce are still staying with Mr. Jarndyce's friend Mr. Boythorn, and while Esther is there, she is visited by Mademoiselle Hortense, who used to be Lady Dedlock's maid, but has either been dismissed or handed in her notice. It's not really that clear, but certainly the impression is that her and Lady Dedlock did not suit one another, and so Hortense has left her, and she goes to see Esther and asks if Esther will make her maid. Esther, who is sadly afraid of Mademoiselle Hortense, says she will not. Esther, Ada and Mr. Jarndyce then return to Bleak House, and while there, Richard continues to visit them very, very regularly. And Richard doesn't seem to be getting on quite so well with the law as perhaps they all hoped. It becomes clear quite quickly that Richard is thinking this is not the profession for him after all. He's still pinning his hopes on Chancery, and if Chancery is doing nothing for him, he suggests that perhaps he give up the law and try the army. While in London, Esther goes to see Caddy and her fiancé Prince, and with Caddy and Prince calls upon Mr. Turveydrop, Prince's father, and encourages Caddy and Prince to inform Mr. Turveydrop that they are in fact engaged, which they do, and after lots of melodrama and assuring that he will still have all the comforts he expects in life and gaining 2 devoted slaves instead of just 1, he kindly gives them his blessing. And Caddy and Esther go on back to Caddy's home to see Mr. and Mrs. Jellyby, and Esther and Caddy tell Mrs. Jellyby that Caddy is engaged, and Mrs. Jellyby, as per usual, is not remotely interested in this whatsoever. The Jellybys seem to be in quite a chaotic state. Mr. Jellyby has just been declared bankrupt, and Mrs. Jellyby, as always, is much more interested in her charity work to do with Africa than she is in anything else. And at the very end of that chapter, Esther goes home, and she's visited by a little girl called Charlie, who we met several chapters before, who was one of Neckett's children, the man who was arrested Skimpole for debt. And Charlie announces to Esther that she is her maid, and is there as a present to her from Mr. Jarndyce, with the idea that she will serve Esther, and also that Esther will kind of help teach her and bring her up in a way as well, Charlie being a girl of I think 12 or 13. And that is how the chapter ends. So, points of interest in this chapter. Quite a lot happens in this chapter, so I'm sure I will have a lot to say. To start off with the very beginning of the chapter, I think it's worth mentioning again the way that Esther kind of feels about Lady Dedlock and the odd dynamic and relationship between them. Her face retained the same influence on me as at first. I do not quite know, even now, whether it was painful or pleasurable, whether it drew me towards her or made me shrink from her. I think I admired her with a kind of fear, and I know that in her presence my thoughts always wandered back, as they had done at first, to that old time of my life. I had a fancy on more than one of these Sundays that what this lady so curiously was to me, I was to her. I mean that I disturbed her thoughts as she influenced mine, though in some different way. But when I stole a glance at her and saw her so composed and distant and unapproachable, I felt this to be a foolish weakness. Indeed, I felt the whole state of my mind in reference to her to be weak and unreasonable, and I remonstrated with myself about it as much as I could. I think there are 2 interesting things in these 2 paragraphs. One is the way Esther feels both sort of drawn to and slightly afraid of Lady Dedlock, and she has a quite weird relationship towards her and a weird sense of kind of interest in her, but also slight discomfort around her. Another thing I find quite interesting is that we know from previous chapters Esther is an observant person. She figures out that Ada and Richard are in love with each other much before almost they do, and she also kind of figures out Caddy's good qualities before Caddy knows them herself, and she guesses a bit about Mr. Boythorn's past life just by his behaviour. She is very, very observant. She has immense powers of emotional intelligence, but she also has a distinct lack of confidence, which means that when her observations tell her that Lady Dedlock is curiously interested in her just as she is in Lady Dedlock, she immediately thinks, no, I must be being foolish and weak, because that is how Esther has kind of trained herself to think about herself, to think that she is not clever, whereas in fact she is. But talking of Esther's confidence, another thing I find really interesting is that for an incredibly modest woman who always presents herself as thinking very lowly of herself, she does really like to report other people complimenting her, and I quite like that in a way, because I always imagine it to be Esther, you know, she's writing this narrative from several years in the future, and at the time when this narrative is written about, when she's sort of like 20 or 21, I think. Then she was really, really underconfident, and she didn't like believe the nice things people said to her. But writing in the future, she is slightly less like underconfident, and a bit more self-assured, and therefore she feels like able to write down the compliments that people paid her in a way of kind of simultaneously acknowledging the lack of confidence and the kind of low self-esteem she had at the time, while also giving clues to the readers that she was actually more clever than she kind of gave herself credit for. Mademoiselle Hortense says to her, "You are good, accomplished and beautiful as an angel." This is definitely not Esther's own view of herself. She does not really view herself as being good. She believes that she is kind of tarnished by her background and her birth, nor does she ever seem to think herself very pretty. In fact, she lays great emphasis on how beautiful Ada is, as though in comparison to her. Now let's talk a little bit about Mademoiselle Hortense, because she always interests me. She's a very interesting character. I like the way she speaks about Lady Dedlock. You get the sense from her words that she really dislikes Lady Dedlock. "I have left my lady. We could not agree. My lady is so high, so very high. Pardon, mademoiselle, it is not for me to come here to complain of my lady, but I say she is so high, so very high. I will not say a word more. All the world knows that." You certainly get the sense that beneath that there is quite a lot of anger against Lady Dedlock. I find it really interesting how Dickens also describes her in this way. "There was a lowering energy in her face as she stood looking at me while I explained the impossibility of my engaging her, which seemed to bring visibly before me some woman from the streets of Paris in the reign of terror." Now this is a really interesting paragraph. I think one, it suggests this kind of like underlying cruelness and something sort of frightening about Mademoiselle Hortense, but also it made me think of Madame Defarge from A Tale of Two Cities, which is 6 years after this book, and I wonder if in a way Mademoiselle Hortense is a kind of early model for Madame Defarge, and if Madame Defarge and Mademoiselle Hortense have quite a lot of connection between them. I'm going to be quite interested to look out for that as we go through the book, because I think it's quite interesting that he describes her in this way. Of course, it's quite significant too in this chapter that the chapter begins with Esther refusing a maid and ends with Esther gaining a maid in very different circumstances. When a woman comes to her to say she wants to serve her, Esther dares not accept her. Partly it's because she doesn't like Hortense, but also it's partly because she doesn't think that she is the sort of person who would have a maid. But when Mr. Jarndyce sends Charlie to her, she is incredibly happy and grateful and kind of sobbing tears of joy that someone would think her worthy to be served. And of course also she likes Charlie, and Charlie is going to be as much a kind of charge as a maid to Esther in some ways. Certainly Charlie is a more sympathetic character than Mademoiselle Hortense. Let's talk a little bit about Richard and his forlorn hopes of the Chancery suit. "He was as vivacious as ever and told us that he was very industrious, but I was not easy in my mind about him. It appeared to me that his industry was all misdirected. I could not find that it led to anything but the formation of delusive hopes in connection with the suit already the pernicious cause of so much sorrow and ruin." The kind of theme of like bad omens looms quite large in Bleak House, especially to do with the character of Miss Flight, who often talks about good omens and bad omens and things like that. And I think it's interesting how Esther sees a lot of bad omens for Richard that Richard can never see for himself, especially if you look at the two characters of Mr. Gridley, who we'll talk about a bit later in the next chapter, and also Miss Flight, two characters who have been made so miserable by their hopes at Chancery, and whom Richard sees nothing in common with in himself, and really just can't understand the connection between himself and them, and between their blighted hopes and his own future hopes. Esther says, talking of Miss Flight, "Richard never thought what a fatal link was riveting between his fresh youth and her faded age, between his free hopes and her caged birds, and her hungry garret and her wandering mind." Dickens leaves us in no doubt whatsoever that the reason why Richard finds it so hard to stick at a profession is because he constantly believes that there is a hope for him that he is suddenly going to inherit lots of money and not have to work in this way, because he believes that his current circumstances are not all his circumstances. "One can't settle down while this business remains in such an unsettled state. If you lived in an unfinished house, you couldn't settle down in it. If you were condemned to leave everything you undertook unfinished, you would find it hard to apply yourself to anything, and yet that's my unhappy case. I was born into this unfinished contention with all its chances and changes, and it began to unsettle me before I quite knew the difference between a suit of law and a suit of clothes, and it has gone on unsettling me ever since. I know what the thought of Ada ought to do for me, but it doesn't do it. I'm too unsettled even for that. I love her most devotedly, and yet I do wrong her in doing myself wrong every day and every hour. But it can't last forever. We shall come on for a final hearing and get judgment in our favour, and then you and Adel shall see what I can really be." Now, I really love Richard and Esther's friendship. It's not that common within Victorian literature to get close male-female friendships, and Esther and Richard is really, really nice because they have a very kind of brotherly, sisterly dynamic, and in a way Richard confines more of his judgment on himself to Esther than he can even to Ada, because he loves Ada so much that it's hard to show himself in his worst light, whereas to Esther he can talk unreservedly and he can say all of these things. And I really like their relationship and the dynamic, the fact that they just go for a walk arm in arm in the street and he like tells her everything that's on his mind, all his troubles, and just like cries before her because he can be vulnerable with her, which I think is really, really strong and really interesting. Now I want to talk a little bit about Richard's changing profession and going into the army, and one line that I find really interesting is this from Esther. I thought, how would this end? How could this end when so soon and so surely all his manly qualities were touched by the fatal blight that ruined everything it rested on? One thing I find really interesting in Bleak House is its exploration of gender, and one thing I wrote about quite a lot in my dissertation on gender in Dickens is how Richard's failure to find a profession that suits him is in many ways within the world of the Victorian novel a failure of masculinity. What middle-class men are supposed to do within the Victorian moral and social system is to find a job and a profession to work hard in order to support their wife and their family and so on. Richard cannot stick at a profession, he cannot work hard and be industrious because the Chancery's suit has ruined him for such things, and therefore it is impossible for him to be considered within Victorian society as a suitable or good husband for Ada because he cannot support her, because he cannot support himself. And in many ways the way this kind of is explored in Bleak House looks at how this is kind of considered by society around him as sort of failure of masculinity, which is something I find really, really interesting in this book. Now let's talk a little bit about the stuff with Caddy and Prince and the Jellybys. I find it really incredibly sad that Caddy says to Esther, "You are the first friend I ever had," and they've only been friends like a few months and Caddy's like in her late teens. It's just so miserable. She hasn't had a very nice life. I also find it weird but quite interesting that she calls Prince my darling child. That is the fond term of endearment that she calls her husband to be. It's a slightly odd infantilization of him, but I also find it quite interesting because it's very common in 19th century literature for men to slightly infantilize their wives. It's like, you know, my little wife, my child wife, my little woman. There's a lot of that. Although, like, you know, sometimes it's used almost ironically, like when Mr. Snagsby calls his wife his little woman, and that woman definitely has much more control and power in their marriage than he does. But I find it quite interesting that Caddy calls Prince my darling child. It almost like reverses the power dynamic in their relationship and makes her the one with kind of more power, and also perhaps in a way emphasises the fact that neither of them have been like properly parented, so they have to like parent each other as well. It's a bit weird, but anyway. Isn't Mr. Turveydrop ridiculous? He's so thoroughly Dickensian in his complete and utter silliness. I love him, it makes me laugh so much. Again you find us, Miss Summerson, using our little arts to polish. Again the sex stimulates us and rewards us by the condescension of its lovely presence. It is much in these times, and we have made an awfully degenerating business of it since the days of His Royal Highness the Priest Regent, my patron, if I may presume to say so, to experience that deportment is not wholly trodden underfoot by mechanics, that it can yet bask in the smile of beauty, my dear madam. And I find it very interesting, of course, to consider the really, really silly, overwrought, flowery way he talks to women in comparison to how he talks to his son. My dear son, you have 4 schools this afternoon. I would recommend a hasty sandwich. He immediately goes back into floral silliness when Caddy and Prince inform them that they are engaged. Engaged? Cried Mr. Turveydrop, reclining on the sofa and shutting out the sight with his hand. An arrow launched at my brain by my own child. It's very, very silly. But it becomes clear quite quickly that why Mr. Turveydrop goes to such great lengths to express his dismay is to ensure that Prince is going to A, remain living with him, which he quickly makes sure is the case, and also remain working at the school, and also that he will kind of keep all the comforts that he has got. He overreacts in order to make them feel that he has sacrificed something for them, whereas in fact they have to sacrifice a lot for him, which Esther gets because, as I already mentioned, she has a lot of emotional intelligence, but poor Caddy and Prince just still think he's a very nice man. I mean, why? And again, I do think that the criticism that is put against Mr. Turveydrop by Dickens is a lot to do with gender. It's a lot to do with the fact that Mr. Turveydrop within the kind of Victorian system is another failure of masculinity because he lives his life entirely for like deportment and kind of ornamentation and show, which is traditionally within Victorian gender roles considered feminine. For yourself, Prince, whose character is different, we cannot be all alike, nor is it advisable that we should. Work, be industrious, earn money, and extend the connection as much as possible. Within their father-son relationship, he expects Prince to carry out all the traditionally masculine roles and him to carry out the kind of traditionally feminine ones of kind of display and accomplishments. I don't have too much to say about the Jellybys in this chapter. Mr. Jellyby is miserable and going bankrupt, and Mrs. Jellyby is preoccupied as always, but I feel like I've spoken quite a lot about the Jellybys before, and I'm sure I will continue to as we go through the rest of the book as well. Certainly I think Dickens very much emphasises that she doesn't even care that her husband is ruined, because she doesn't even really care that her daughter is going to be married, which is, you know, within the Victorian system is supposed to be something very, very important to a mother. So I think definitely we see more criticisms of Mrs. Jellyby in this chapter, but I do think I've talked about Mrs. Jellyby and Dickens's criticisms of her quite a lot before, so I think we'll move on to the next chapter instead. Chapter 24, An Appeal Case. And the chapter begins with Esther and Ada interrupting a conversation between Mr. Jarndyce and Richard, in which they discover they've had a very big argument, and Mr. Jarndyce has told Richard that he thinks he ought by rights to give up his engagement to Ada, that they ought to continue on as nothing more than cousins, and that for them to be any engagement between them when Richard has wasted all of the money that he had trying out different professions, and when Richard has very much failed to stick at one and is in no fit state to marry and will probably not be for several years, Mr. Jarndyce says he must give up Ada for the time being, and that he as Ada's guardian kind of insists upon it. And Ada, surprisingly, in fact, kind of agrees to what Mr. Jarndyce says, and says perhaps it is for the best for now if we continue on as cousins. In this chapter, Esther also meets Mr. George, who we met in September's chapters, who I am very, very fond of, as I've mentioned before. And Mr. George is struck by something in Esther that he feels like he has seen somewhere before, though he doesn't quite know where. And the next day, Esther goes to the Chancery Court with Richard to watch the proceedings, and while there encounters Mr. Guppy, who presents Mrs. Rachel, who used to look after her when she was a girl. After that, they meet Miss Flight, and also again meet Mr. George, who says that he has come to find Miss Flight on purpose because he has a man, Mr. Gridley, who we've met before, staying with him, who is ill at his shooting gallery, who knew Miss Flight and who is an old friend of hers. So Esther and Richard and Miss Flight and Mr. George all head off back to George's shooting gallery, and while there, they meet outside a man who says he is the doctor. Only as soon as they get into the house, he takes off his disguise, and it turns out it's Mr. Bucket, the detective, who is fantastic. And he says that he is there because he has a warrant out for Gridley's arrest, and he knows that he is staying with George, and he has tricked them in order to get through the door. So they do take Mr. Bucket to Gridley. But Mr. Gridley is incredibly ill, very much struggling. All the fight has gone out of him after all these years of struggling against Chancery, and at the end of the chapter he dies. So, points of interest in this chapter. There is again a lot to discuss. To talk a bit about Richard and his inconsistencies, I think it's interesting as well that when the Lord Chancellor is very cross with Richard for being indecisive and trifling with them, Richard says, a pretty good joke, I think, from that quarter. He is annoyed with the Chancery Court for being cross with him for being indecisive when the Chancery Court is itself so indecisive. But really what we see there as a reader is that Richard has become like the system that has made him. I think it's interesting too in this chapter to observe the changed relationship between Richard and Mr. Jarndyce. There is a new great tension between them, and Richard clearly feels incredibly hard done by. I think as well the fact that Mr. Jarndyce is in general so cheerful seems to grate on Richard all the more. That he can cheerfully ask him to give up his engagement to the woman he loves is such an insult to Richard in many ways. And then there is one moment in this chapter where Mr. Jarndyce's cheerfulness breaks and we get an outburst which I think is really, really telling. Richard says, "But what I have of certainty, sir, is not all I have." "Rick, Rick," cried my guardian, with a sudden terror in his manner and in an altered voice, and putting up his hands as if he would have stopped his ears. "For the love of God, don't found a hope or expectation on the family curse. Whatever you do on this side of the grave, never give one lingering glance towards the horrible phantom that has haunted us so many years. Better to borrow, better to beg, better to die." Pretty dramatic, but then Mr. Jarndyce has been with this case a lot longer than them and knows rather a lot more about how this case works. I think it's interesting to look at what Mr. Jarndyce does here. Effectively, he breaks up Ada and Richard for the time being because he feels it is his duty as a guardian to do so. I think this is also very interesting in terms of gender and in terms of the very, very different expectations on Richard and Ada being in the same sort of circumstances in many ways and both being under the guardianship of Mr. Jarndyce, but because Richard is a man, he's expected to behave in life in a very, very different way, to make something of himself and to, in order to marry Ada, be able to look after her. And because Mr. Jarndyce thinks that he cannot, and because he is still able to look after Ada, he therefore feels it necessary to break up their engagement in order to protect Ada. In fact, he says to Richard, "It is better for her, much better. You owe it to her." And it's interesting too that Ada herself seems to accept this, and I find her speech quite interesting here when she does kind of say she will give up Richard for the time being, because effectively it's very clear that although she gives him up in a kind of formal fashion because Mr. Jarndyce has told her to and she trusts Mr. Jarndyce's word, and also in a way wants Lord of Richard to do better for himself as he might do without the kind of partly distraction of her but also the kind of pressure on him to do well for her. But at the same time, it's very clear that she is not emotionally giving him up and that she intends to still kind of consider herself in a way as bound to him. Your mind may be quite at ease about me, for you will leave me here under his care, and be sure that I can have nothing to wish for, quite sure, if I guide myself by his advice. I don't doubt, Cousin Richard, said Ada, a little confused, that you are very fond of me, and I don't think you will fall in love with anybody else, but I should like you to consider well about it too, as I should like you to be in all things very happy. You may trust me, Cousin Richard, I am not at all changeable, but I am not unreasonable and should never blame you. Even cousins may be sorry to part, and in truth I am very, very sorry, Richard, though I know it's for your welfare. I shall always think of you affectionately, and often talk of you with Esther, and perhaps you will sometimes think a little of me, Cousin Richard. So now we are only cousins again, Richard, for the time perhaps, and I pray for a blessing on my dear cousin wherever he goes. Let's talk a little bit about Mr. George's visit to the house. One thing I find quite interesting, as I already mentioned, is that Mr. George seems to know Esther from somewhere, and in fact he seems to have a similar reaction to her that we kind of saw in the last chapter, her having to Lady Dedlock. He sat down, a little disconcerted by my presence, I thought, and without looking at me, drew his heavy sunburned hand across his upper lip. Miss Summerson, he repeated, and looked at me again. Do you know the name? I asked. No, miss. To my knowledge, I have never heard it. I thought I had seen you somewhere. I think not, I returned. I remember faces very well. So do I, miss, he returned. Humph, what set me off now upon that? I love Mr. George. I love that when he's like a bit awkward about the fact that he assumed that Richard was in love with Esther rather than Ada, Esther makes a joke about it. He says, no offence, I hope, miss. I am one of the roughs. I just like him. I like that he's so unapologetic about the fact that he has slightly bad manners. He's just the best. Anyway, I also think it's interesting to note here as well that we get another report from Mr. George that in his new profession of the military, Richard is also not going on so well. If Mr. Carstone was to give his full mind to it, he would come out very good. And Esther's description of the Chancery Court is interesting to see here too, because we have had descriptions of the Chancery Court before, back in the very first chapter, I believe, but then it was from the third-person omniscient narrator, who is quite different, whereas this time it is from Esther's perspective. And yet we get the same kind of critique of the mess of the law, to see everything going on so smoothly, and to think of the roughness of the suitors' lives and deaths, to see all that full dress and ceremony, and to think of the waste and want and beggared misery it represented, to consider that, while the sickness of hope deferred was raging in so many hearts, that polite show went on calmly from day to day, and from year to year, in such good order and composure, to behold the Lord Chancellor and the whole array of practitioners under him looking at one another and at all the spectators, as if nobody had ever heard that all over England the name in which they were assembled was a bitter jest, was held in universal horror, contempt and indignation, known for something so flagrant and bad that little short of a miracle could bring anything good out of it to anyone. It was so curious and self-contradictory to me, who had no experience of it, that it was at first incredible and I could not comprehend it. And then later, the Lord Chancellor then threw down the bundle of paper from his desk to the gentleman below him, and somebody said, Jarndyce and Jarndyce. Upon this there was a buzz and a laugh, and a general withdrawal of the bystanders, and a bringing of great heaps and piles and bags full of paper. What a mess it all seems to be, and how awful it seems to Esther, who is very logical and hard-working and intelligent, that this should continue on in such an utter chaos. And Dickens, of course, criticises a lot in this book the disorder of the law, but I think he also, in this chapter, really criticises the hypocrisy of it, that everything looks, from an outsider, to be smooth and showy, and everyone is well-dressed, and everyone seems to know what they're doing, but actually it's all kind of a facade, and actually underneath the surface nobody seems to know what they're doing, and they're just causing misery for so many people, such as Gridley later on in this chapter. Now there's one thing I noticed in this chapter which I hadn't noticed before, which is that Miss Flight calls Esther Fitz Jarndyce, and she does it because for her, sort of Esther is like side by side to Jarndyce, but not quite in Jarndyce, and therefore she calls her Fitz Jarndyce. But it's very interesting to note that Fitz was traditionally and historically in Britain used in the surname of an illegitimate son. So I don't know much about the origin or why this was the case, but certainly the prefix Fitz is associated with illegitimacy, which obviously is connected with Esther in terms of her being born out of wedlock, and also makes sense because Esther is sort of emotionally bound up in the cause of Jarndyce and Jarndyce, but not legally bound up in the cause of Jarndyce and Jarndyce. The people who are her surrogate family are all bound up in the case of Jarndyce and Jarndyce, but she herself is legally not. Let's go on to the scene at Mr. George's shooting gallery where we encounter Mr. Bucket and where we encounter Gridley and where Gridley dies, because this is a really interesting chapter. I want to first talk about the character of Mr. Bucket because I do find him so interesting. So also, it's non-fiction November at the moment and I'm reading a book called The Suspicions of Mr. Witcher by Kate Summerscale, which I'm really enjoying. It focuses on one detective, Mr. Witcher, within the Victorian period, but it also talks a lot about like literary portrayals of detectives, and so she just talks about Mr. Bucket all the time, and I'm like, I just read that quote you mentioned, which makes me pleased. Anyway, I like that Mr. Bucket kind of seems to become like almost magical. He was dressed as a doctor, then he comes in the door and the physician stopped and taking off his hat appeared to vanish by magic and to leave another and quite different man in his place. It really reminds me of like Sherlock Holmes, and I do think to a certain extent like there are bits of Sherlock Holmes that you can see were modelled to a certain extent on Mr. Bucket in Bleak House in terms of the disguises and the kind of impressive rapidity of the disguises, and also in terms of like his manner of being clever and noticing things. And also like in this chapter, as I noticed earlier in the previous chapter, which we read in September called Mr. Bucket, that Mr. Bucket is very good at like making people behave in a certain way by telling them their personalities or what he thinks their personality should be, or what at this present moment would suit him for their personalities to be in order to make them behave in that way. He says to Mr. George, "Now George, you're a sensible man and a well-conducted man, that's what you are beyond a doubt. And mind you, I don't talk to you as a common character because you have served your country and you know that when duty calls we must obey." And what does Mr. George do? When duty calls and Mr. Bucket has a legal duty to perform, Mr. George accepts it and he lets Mr. Bucket into the room. I don't know how Dickens does it that Mr. Bucket comes to this house to arrest a dying man, and somehow I still feel sympathetic with Mr. Bucket, and I think it's because there is a kind of like camaraderie between him and Mr. Gridley, a kind of complete absence of any like resentment or anger, just this is my role, this is yours, I'm really sorry about this. He really wants Gridley to fight with him because he really wants Mr. Gridley to be well enough to fight with him. It's as though he has kind of enjoyed their being sort of enemies over a long period of time. "Come, come," he said, "don't go on in that way, Mr. Gridley. You are only a little low. We are all of us a little low sometimes. I am. Hold up, hold up. You'll lose your temper with the whole round of them again and again, and I shall take you on a score of warrants yet if I have luck. Don't shake your head, nod it, that's what I want to see you do. Why, Lord bless your soul, what times we have had together. Haven't I seen you in the Fleet over and over again for contempt? Haven't I come into court 20 afternoons for no other purpose than to see you pin the Chancellor like a bulldog? Don't you remember when you first began to threaten the lawyers and the peace was sworn against you 2 or 3 times a week? Ask the little old lady there, she has always been present. Hold up, Mr. Gridley, hold up, sir." But let's move on to talking about Mr. Gridley and his death. I think it's really interesting to look at his relationship and his friendship with Miss Flight, especially because, as I have already said in this video, male-female friendships aren't that common in Victorian literature, and in these 2 chapters we have a very good portrait of Esther and Richard's friendship, and then also a portrait of the friendship between Miss Flight and Mr. Gridley. The pair of them are bound together in sorrow because of their chancery suits that have failed. Touchingly and awfully drawn together, he and the little mad woman were side by side and as it were alone. She sat on a chair holding his hand and none of us went close to them. And when Mr. Gridley dies, she screams because they have been friends and they have been close, and because she doesn't have that many people that she loves. And it's a really powerful moment in a way. And it shows you very differently how the kind of mess of chancery has affected these 2 different people. It's driven Miss Flight perhaps a little mad, and it's driven Mr. Gridley to anger, misery and death. "I thought boastfully that they could never break my heart, Mr. Jarndyce. I was resolved that they should not. I did believe that I could and would charge them with being the mockery they were until I died of some bodily disorder. But I'm worn out. How long I have been wearing out, I don't know. I seem to break down in an hour. I hope they may never come to hear of it. I hope everybody here will lead them to believe that I died defying them consistently and perseveringly as I did through so many years." And in a way, I feel like Mr. Bucket's whole speech that I read out a moment ago, telling Mr. Gridley that he's not worn out and that all he wants is a fight, is kind of his way of making Mr. Gridley believe it and making Gridley believe that he is dying still fighting rather than dying in the weak state he is. And now on to chapter 25, Mrs. Snagsby Sees It All. In this chapter we discover that Mrs. Snagsby is not terribly happy about her husband at the moment because she has figured out that he is keeping some kind of secret from her, although she does not know what. and she begins to suspect that the secret is all bound up with Jo, and that Jo is Mr. Snagsby's illegitimate child. She forces Jo to come back to the house and listen to a sermon by Mr. Chasabond, which Jo is really not very interested in, and at the end of the chapter, Jo heads home, given a little bit more money to see him on his way by Mr. Snagsby, and Mrs. Snagsby stays behind, suspecting everything. So, points of interest in this chapter. I want to talk a little bit about the character of Mr. Snagsby, because I find him a very interesting man. He's really, in many ways, the wrong man to be mixed up with the kind of mischief and mystery to do with Mr. Bucket and Mr. Tulkinghorn and Jo and the woman in the veil. He doesn't understand what's going on, and it distresses him because he is a man who is quiet and meek and afraid of the world in many ways, and because he doesn't understand what's going on. Mr. Snagsby cannot make out what it is that he has to do with. Something is wrong somewhere, but what something, what may come of it, to whom, when, and from which unthought of and unheard quarter is the puzzle of his life. In many ways it seems like he is not just afraid of what this mystery is, but also afraid of this mystery doing harm to someone, and he doesn't know to whom. His marriage with his wife is clearly a very unhealthy and messed up one. Neither of them really seem to talk to each other. Mr. Snagsby is terrified of her, with kind of good reason, because she's not very nice. She knows that his secretiveness is about something, and it leads her to think again and again of various scandals and of Jo. And then when Jo comes to the house, why else should that look pass between them? Why else should Mr. Snagsby be confused and cough a single cough behind his hand? It is as clear as crystal that Mr. Snagsby is the boy's father. Which seems highly unlikely, but is something Mrs. Snagsby is very highly convinced of. Perhaps because Mrs. Snagsby is not a very nice person, and doesn't really occur to her that Mr. Snagsby might have like an innocent interest in anyone for no reason apart from the fact that he feels sorry for them. Let's talk a little bit about Mr. Chadband and his sermon to Jo. Again, I think Dickens is very, very critical of certain elements of religion within his books, especially of people like Mr. Chadband, whose religion is all fire and brimstone and no kindness. Mr. Chadband is from that Victorian school of thought that believes that people are poor because they are bad. This is what he says of Jo. We have here among us, my friends, a Gentile and a heathen, a dweller in the tents of Tom all Alones, and a mover on upon the surface of the earth, a brother and a boy, devoid of parents, devoid of relations, devoid of flocks and herbs, devoid of gold and silver and of precious stones. Now, my friend, why do I say he is devoid of these possessions? Why is he? Because he is devoid of the light that shines in upon some of us. And for him, the reason why Jo is poor is because he does not believe in God, rather than the fact that he doesn't believe in God because he doesn't know anything about God or the Bible, because he has had no education whatsoever, and also because the most important thing for Jo is to find a place to sleep and to find something to eat, because those are the greatest concerns of his life, because that is the only thing he is able to worry about, because he has so little comfort and so little chance of a home and security within his life. I think one of the saddest bits in like the whole book almost is when Jo talks to the maid, Gusta, and Gusta gives him some dinner, some supper, bread and cheese, and then Gusta pats him on the shoulder, that's all. Jo stops in the middle of a bite and looks petrified, for this orphan has patted him on the shoulder, and it is the first time in his life that any decent hand has so laid upon him. He is so rarely touched like with affection and sympathy that he's just really, really confused by it, which I find like really, really sad. Before Jo leaves, Mrs. Snagsby gives him a bit more money, and then Mrs. Snagsby watches from the corner. A ghostly shade, frilled and nightcapped, follows the law stationer to the room he came from and glides higher up. And henceforth he begins, go where he will, to be attended by another shadow than his own, hardly less constant than his own, hardly less quiet than his own. And into whatsoever atmosphere of secrecy his own shadow may pass, let all concerned in the secrecy beware. For the watchful Mrs. Snagsby is there too, bone of his bone, flesh of his flesh, shadow of his shadow. So that is everything I want to talk about for October's chapters. In the month of November, we will be reading the next 4 chapters of Bleak House. There's 4 chapters this time, I believe. Chapter 26, Sharp Shooters. Chapter 27, More Old Soldiers Than One. Chapter 28, The Ironmaster. And Chapter 29, The Young Man. All very good chapters. I especially like Sharpshooters. Plenty more Mr. George in the next section, which makes me happy because I like Mr. George. So, anyway, such a great book. So many more exciting chapters to come. So that is all. I'm glad that I'm finally up to speed again with the Bleak House read-along. I hope that you have been carrying on reading it and enjoying it. Please let me know down in the comments what you thought of October's chapters, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.